Spirituality, as we have seen in the last podcast, cannot be denying yourself pleasures, since that logically would lead to the suicidal person being the most spiritual. There is another idea that spirituality cannot be. Let's look at the opposite extreme of asceticism, which is the idea that pain and deprivation will lead to a spiritual state. What is that opposite idea? Well, perhaps spirituality means that a person should indulge themselves in the moment, seize the day, and make the most of every single moment in life to get the most pleasure out of it. This, too, is a very old approach to spirituality. This is known as hedonism. Hedonism teaches that the more experiences we have, the more money we make, the more things we acquire, the more we prosper in life, then we must be spiritual, or we would not be having such a great time. Evidently, we conclude, God must be pleased with us and smiling on us. This hedonistic form of spirituality is popular with those who do not believe in God or an afterlife, and so they choose to live here and now and get all they can out of the right now. They say that religion and spirituality in general teaches people to live for a better future, a pie in the sky, and they would rather have their slice right now instead of in the future. Prosperity doctrines of all kinds are hedonistic. Any spiritual path that teaches if you do spirituality right, then you will have plenty of money, fame, etc., as a sign of God's blessing. This is hedonism. This is a hedonistic teaching that essentially claims that pleasure is spirituality. Whereas the ascetics taught that pain brought spirituality, hedonists teach that pleasure brings spirituality. However, hedonism fails to investigate itself. It might feel good, and one might do it, but what are the consequences? Usually too much pleasure will eventually bring pain. For instance, too much liquor and one gets hungover. Too much food, one gets obese. Too many sexual partners, and one gets infected with HIV. Since pleasure ultimately brings pain, then hedonism cannot be a path to spirituality, or pleasure would only result in greater pleasure as a result of pleasure, but this is never the case. Too much pleasure always leads to pain. Also, what are the ramifications of seeking pleasure as spirituality? For one person to succeed, for one person to be rich, others have to not succeed and not be rich. Since there is no such thing as everyone succeeding or everyone being rich, then hedonism must be at the expense of others. If I live an opulent and overindulgent lifestyle, someone else is living quite differently from me to support my opulent way of life. I doubt that we would think someone was very spiritual if they lived a life of excess at the expense of someone else. And also, if spirituality is hedonistic, why doesn't the ultimate pleasure exist? It seems that pleasures, no matter how good they might be, never last. They pass away, they cease, they fizzle. Then we must chase even more experience of pleasure so that we may exceed the last pleasure. This leads to rampant consumerism, self-indulgence of every kind, that simply must cost others, who must produce the goods and experiences needed to achieve this sort of spirituality. Since both pleasure and pain do not last, it seems that both asceticism and hedonism only offer temporary feelings of being spiritual or having a spiritual experience. Pain and pleasure do not last. They cannot last. Both are fleeting, no matter if you kill yourself through pleasure or kill yourself through pain. Pure asceticism and hedonism both lead to the death of the practitioner, which, ironically, will end the pleasure of the hedonist and will end the pain of the ascetic. So neither of these paths are satisfying, even in death. Obviously, We are tricked if we think giving up pleasure or seeking pleasure are paths to a lasting spirituality. But, as I'm sure you have already noticed, we have yet to describe what spirituality is. I know what the problem is. The problem is with the word spirit. The moment we hear spirit, we think of religion, and then we think of all of the values of the religion we were taught, and imagine that anyone with those values is spiritual. But even in religion, no matter which religion in the entire world, most of the values, sadly, are based on asceticism, denying yourself something pleasurable, or hedonism, trying to gain the best from life using a religious path. Perhaps we should think of a word to replace spirituality. Or perhaps we should examine the word spirituality itself so that we can come to a definition about which we may speak. Exploring what the word spirituality means and sweeping away our misconceptions and getting a definition on the table that we can understand and agree upon will be the topic of the next podcast.